I would like to introduce you today to the whole field of translation. I have been in this for many, many decades, and I am of the opinion that you cannot live in the 21st century without being involved in translation. I go back to the great person in terms of having talked about translation, George Steiner, who said all acts of communication are acts of translation. So when we read a text, we translate. When we talk to people, we translate. And when we then try to get into the field of literature, we are continuously involved in the act of translation and interpretation. And I would like to illustrate this a little, how things have changed from the 19th century to the 20th century by focusing on a poet whom I have studied inside out by the name of Charles Baudelaire. Charles Baudelaire created his major work, The Flowers of Evil, in 1857. That is a work that has haunted every writer, every poet, and even the great American poet Poe translated many parts of Charles Baudelaire into English, and therefore Charles Baudelaire became very well known in the English-speaking world. There is no poet either in South America, in Europe, or in the United States who is not familiar with Charles Baudelaire. Charles Baudelaire has changed the way we look at the world. And his major work, The Flowers of Evil, Les Fleurs du Mal, have changed even how we interpret words. We normally don't associate flowers with evil. And this is the first change. Before Baudelaire, a great number of poets were interested in describing what they saw. And all of a sudden, Baudelaire is bored with this, and quite a few other poets at that time are bored with describing what we see. We begin to change our attitude towards the reading, towards the perception of the world. What we see is not what we see, but how we interact with what we see. So these poets and writers all of a sudden establish a different way of interacting with the world. They don't tell you there is a house or there is a flower. No, they are projecting very clearly of how they interact with this and how that changes it. It becomes a much more active interaction with the world. It's a dialogue that they are producing. And therefore, we have difficulties today because we want to be entertained. We want to have somebody tell us what there is. But with the poetry, starting with Baudelaire, all of a sudden we have to become involved in the power and the movement of words. Furthermore, we see in Baudelaire for the first time that things are not the same as they were before, because Baudelaire says, les parfums, les couleurs et les sons se répondent. This is something that nobody before had done, that all of a sudden you can establish a relationship between perfumes and colors, and between perfumes and colors and sounds. This opens a totally new universe for the 20th and the 21st century. I come back to the idea that Flowers of Evil in itself is a different way of relating to objects that are in our environment. Normally, we think of flowers being beautiful and not representing the worst and the bad and the ugly. But Baudelaire is interested in showing that in our relationship with a flower, we all of a sudden begin to see the world in a different way. Les fleurs du mal, the flowers of evil, changes the entire way of how we begin to interpret the world in the 19th century and then naturally in the 20th century and the 21st century. If I go back then, when he says les parfums, les couleurs et les sons se répandent, is the opening to multimedia in the 20th and the 21st century. We can replace the color with sound, we can replace the sound with perfume, and all of a sudden the couleur, the colors, can be sound, or the colors can be something else, and no longer the definition as we would find it in the dictionary. Therefore, there is a new quality also in Baudelaire, and that is not only the meaning of words are being explored, but also the sound of the words and the images are being explored. Therefore, that poetry is of a totally different character, and it has attracted a great number of composers. The composers, like Debussy, for example, was very much attracted by 19th century poets and poetry, and has transformed and here's the word again, has translated poems into music. We have had this in the 19th century already, let's say with Goethe and maybe Schiller and some other 19th century poets, but once we get into the area of Baudelaire and related poets like Mallarmé, then we see that this becomes an extremely driving force that we have not seen before. At the same time then, the major poem that we have coming from Charles Baudelaire is a poem called Correspondence. Correspondence, here are the flowers of evil, and the main poem in there is Correspondence. What does it mean? That everything corresponds to something else, and that's why he can say les parfums, les couleurs et les sons se répandent. The colors, the perfumes, the colors, and the sounds respond to each other. I come back to Baudelaire because he is probably the driving force in changing the way we have looked at poetry and maybe in writing in general. It is much more intense, perhaps shorter and more explosive, and therefore I, the reader and the translator, have to tune in to this kind of different thinking that we have not had before. And from then on, from Charles Baudelaire through Mallarmé and Apollinaire and a few other poets, we then go to T.S. Eliot. T.S. Eliot cannot be thought of without knowing Charles Baudelaire. And therefore, the notion then becomes that I, the reader, have to approach these works with a different attitude. I have to translate them because they're not telling me what there is, but I have to translate it and interpret it so that I become part of the atmosphere. And I would say that especially both in the poetry and in the music in the 19th century, starting with Baudelaire, it has become an explosion of sound, of words, and the sound that's in words. And a word does no longer exist only because it has a meaning. And therefore, what I would like to communicate, that each one of us has to learn how to translate a word and not just talk about the word. Therefore, what we achieve by studying Baudelaire and some of the same poets at that particular time, they will tell us that the pulse of the present is an explosive pulse and no longer a meditative pulse. And therefore, we need to reorient ourselves, and therefore also we have great difficulties in reading poems and poets like Charles Baudelaire, who by himself has created a new universe in the overall context of the change of literature in the middle of the 19th century. My fascination with this kind of work, with this kind of poetry, is that we become once again reconnected to the word, not only as meaning, but as sound and as image. And that is the characteristic, if you think this into the modern age, is the characteristic of the multimedia. And therefore, I also am very much interested that we reconnect with the word, and not the word as a static piece on the page, but the word with its internal movements that I, as the reader, have to uncover and then translate it into the text that I am reading. I also think that any person who writes poetry must become very much involved in the act of translation, because this is as close as you can get to the understanding of a text. I am keenly aware that a great number of us had problems at the very beginning to rethink the function of poetry. Poetry is no longer has no longer the function of entertaining, but poetry has the function of being recreated individually by each one of us, because it energizes our own thinking, our own creativity, and ultimately maybe even our own writing and thinking about poetry and the writing in general.